Well, good morning and welcome to our webinar. As always, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, paying my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm Crystal Laco, the chair of Coalition Conservation. We're a not-for-profit that advocates for an effective climate agenda in line with conservative principles. We've been engaging with conservatives around the globe, including the US Republicans, to support each other on our efforts towards reducing carbon emissions. The US and Australia have long been allies in trade, and we've worked together to promote global trade liberalization for more than 50 years now. We also enjoy a very strong people-to-people links based on common values and on our deep historical and cultural bonds. With the recent formation of the trilateral AUKUS military partnership, there is an amplified focus on the Australia-US relationship. As this new partnership begins, it's timely to look at the broader way in which Australia and the US can work together as leaders in this region to address climate challenges, to support each other in climate threats, and create shared economic opportunities associated with a sustainable future. So today, as part of our international series, we'll be welcoming our special guest joining us from the US, policy analyst and former advisor to President Trump and to President George W. Bush, DaveBanks, and Australia's ambassador to the USA, His Excellency Sinodinos. And from Australia, we'll be welcoming New South Wales Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg, who's the chair of the Environment and Communications Legislation Committee, and Dave Sharma, the Liberal member for Wentworth. And he's also a former diplomat, having served as Australia's ambassador to Israel. We'll also be joined at the end of our panel discussion by the Liberal member for North Sydney, Trent Zimmerman, who will be doing the final remarks. Now, in terms of format, I'll invite our guests from the US to outline their key messages first, and then we'll go straight into a panel discussion where I'll ask questions to the panelists, including those from the audience. So please type your questions in the Q&A box, and the webinar will be recorded. The recording will be sent to everyone who registered. So let me start with DaveBanks. Dave is an economist. He's a political analyst. He's also a policy advocate focusing on climate change, energy, and trade. He's the senior fellow in climate and trade policy and nuclear energy at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and fellow international climate policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Dave is a former Republican chief strategist on the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and he was a senior advisor on climate to Presidents Donald Trump and George W. Bush. Dave, good evening to you in Washington, and thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. You've worked very closely with Republicans for many years on energy and climate policy alongside presidents with varying approaches. So could you please broadly set the US's current climate landscape and policies? And I'll ask you to unmute yourself, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and the audience. You know, I get a lot of questions about, where the Republican Party is today. Look, it's no secret that the GOP, the Republican Party, has had a lot of climate skepticism and has been really the party of no, probably for, I guess I would say, the past 12 years or so. So we've had a very, very little effort over the past 12 or so years to really develop a Republican climate policy and bring us to the table to help shape the national discussion. So if you look at where US climate policy is today, that's largely shaped by the Democratic agenda. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of parallels between the Democratic agenda and where the Europeans are, right? European climate policy is very, very similar to what the climate policy is for the Democratic Party. And so I think that a lot of people, and it's been that way for so long, that I think a lot of people are skeptical when they hear, I guess, productive points being made by Republicans. And so let me answer one question up front, because I get this all the time. Is this real? Are we actually seeing a real shift within the GOP on climate policy? And the answer is yes. And I think that's the case for several reasons. First of all, I would say, well, let's break it into three groups of folks. The first group of folks is motivated by politics. There's an increasing awareness within the GOP that younger voters who lean right, as well as independent voters, care about climate change. There's a big difference between generations. Those voters want Republicans to offer solutions to addressing climate change. They may not have an answer, but they want us to come up with one. So for many of them as well, and I think this is an important point, and this might be, something that that you've also experienced in Australia, but I think for a lot of younger people, for independents, they see climate change as a litmus test. If you accept the science, if you believe it's a problem, then that's important in and of itself. Okay, so GOP leadership certainly recognizes that Republicans, if we want to be competitive nationally, if we don't have a constructive position on climate, that's a problem. That's a liability. And certainly control of the House of Representatives runs through those purple districts, those swing districts and the suburbs. So if we're going to capture enough of those seats to have the majority, we're going to have a constructive position on climate change. Second, there's another group which is really motivated by economic interests, and this gets to how the Democratic Party has largely defined, almost exclusively defined, the narrative around U.S. climate policy. And that is, I think for a lot of Republicans who come from energy intensive districts, from districts that have a lot of energy intensive manufacturing, obviously production of crude natural gas, coal, they look at Democrats and they think, wow, we have been disengaged for so long. We've allowed Democrats to not only shape the agenda, but they continue to go off the rails and introduce climate policies that would actually be detrimental to U.S. national security interests. So, for example, their push to keep U.S. fossil fuels in the ground would clearly undermine our energy security. At least that's from a GOP perspective. That's certainly our position. And ironically, and I think you probably heard these points in Australia, but if we keep our fossil fuels in the ground and we import them from other places, it actually increases global emissions because U.S. production of those resources is generally cleaner than most of our competing suppliers. So there's an awareness of Republicans, look, we need to be aggressive in tabling pragmatic solutions, but to prevent the far left from totally dominating the national discussion. And again, keep in mind that a lot of Republicans represent rural districts and states that have a lot of energy production and carbon intensive manufacturing. So not being part of that discussion risk bad policies emerging that could be detrimental to their districts. And then the third group, look, I mean, there are quite a few Republicans already in the Congress who believe in climate change, right? They've always accepted the science, and they want to actually do something to address climate change and reduce emissions. Now, they just didn't have the political cover to lean forward, and now they do. So I think those are really positive developments within the GOP. And that's just not happening in the House of Representatives, but it's happening in the Senate as well. And that's a huge change from, I think, what you saw in the Trump administration, where I don't think you had any one individual, or at least at a political level, working to develop a climate change position for the administration. Now, then I get asked the question about U.S. reliability as an international partner. And will Republicans play ball at some point? And I think the answer is yes, but it's a very nuanced position, though, that will require a bit of a history lesson. And maybe we can get into that later on with some of the questions and answers. But I do think, just in short, putting the history lesson aside, the way that the Paris Agreement was negotiated, because it wasn't negotiated as a treaty from the U.S. perspective. So it's an agreement, a political agreement the United States can join without congressional buy-in. I think that as long as we don't carve out a role for the Congress in at least helping shape the National Determined Contribution, or the pledge, the NDC, I think you're going to have these huge swings whenever the White House flips, goes from blue to red, red to blue. So With that, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. There are some similarities, as you mentioned, between the Republicans and the coalition here when it comes to climate, but it's nice to hear there's been a bit of a change in the way the congressional Republicans are talking about climate. But we'll get back to that. And now it's my pleasure to welcome the Honourable Arthur Sinodinos, who took up his post as Australia's ambassador to the United States in February last year. Welcome, Arthur. It's wonderful to have you here with us. And there are significant changes. There have been significant changes in the US political landscape since your arrival in Washington early last year. Could you share with us your perspective on how this, maybe perhaps on the corporate and investment sectors, how they're responding to the government's focus on climate in the US, and how the relationship between US and Australia has transformed as a result of the change in government and other geopolitical influences?
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. It's great to be with you, and congratulations to the Coalition for Conservation on what you're doing, providing sort of fact-based analysis on these very important issues. And to pick up on Dave's point about the transition from a Republican administration to a Democrat administration here, the thing that struck me when I got here last year was exactly what Dave said, that at the political level within the Republican administration, there was not much talk about climate change. The US had withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, and there was more focus on continuing to promote energy security and energy independence through the development of fossil fuels, oil and gas, and the like. So, of course, one of the big changes was that in the election campaign, Joe Biden made tackling climate change a central plank of his program. To what extent it swung votes in different states, hard to tell, disentangled from other factors. Some people would argue that the real reason Joe Biden won the election is because he wasn't Donald Trump. But leaving that aside, he put a program to the electorate. He made it clear that that was a program that he had negotiated with some of the major unions in the US, in the oil and gas sector and the electrical sector, who are asking, where did the jobs come from if we make this sort of transition? And his pitch to the electorate was that climate change is an existential crisis. We have to make choices to deflect and avoid this crisis occurring. He made it clear on becoming the administration, becoming the president, that this was a whole of government priority. And so what he did was to establish a whole series of policies across the government. So the government here, the administration, is very joined up on these climate issues. As you go across departments, they've all been given responsibility for determining climate change related policies in their own areas, including, for example, and it's most recently been discussed here, the Department of Defense. So this is very much a joined up government priority to deal with climate change. One of the first things that the administration did was to re-enter the Paris Agreement, and what it's done with its legislation, which is now before the Congress, is, pardon me, put up a whole slew of climate-related measures. These measures relate both to incentives to decarbonise the power sector. The commitment is to decarbonise the power sector completely by 2035. They've made commitments to incentivise the take-up of electric vehicles, infrastructure to be financed to provide electric vehicle charging stations throughout the country. They've tried to marry their green investment with infrastructure investment where possible. They've also indicated that they're going to take regulatory action to reverse some measures that the previous administration took, which impacted on the capacity to pursue environmental objectives. So as part of that, there's also money, something like 45 billion for transition in communities which are affected by the need for industries to move on. This is coal communities and the like, power communities. So they've indicated that they accept that there is an economic cost that has to be met in making these transitions. But they've also argued that there's an economic cost, an escalating cost, if they don't deal with climate change. And the costs of dealing with climate change increase as time goes on, as the burden of adjustment becomes bigger and bigger. That legislation is now before the Congress. So obviously there will be questions about to what extent the US is able to meet those commitments in due course, but they are fighting very hard to get those infrastructure bills through the Congress over the next month or so. On the international diplomacy side, the administration have increased their nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. For 2030, they've upped their target from around 26-28% to something like 45 to 50%, 55% sort of range, because they argue that to meet the goal of keeping the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we have to have intermediate targets like that on the way to a net zero target by 2050. As part of their international diplomacy, they've been working with us and other countries on how we are more ambitious in dealing with climate change. The main avenue for Australia and the US to work on this has been the Quad. We have a working group on the Quad, which met in person the other day. Some of the outcomes of the climate working group are working further on green shipping, working further on hydrogen, working further on climate finance and adaptation, with particular reference to the issues of small island developing nations. The good thing about the Quad is that it's been a good place to discuss these issues, because nations like Australia, which have been historically major fossil fuel exporters, face different adjustment challenges to, say, Europe, or now the US, which has moved through shale oil to be more energy independent. And then you've got India in there, which has got major challenges. And the argument of the Indians is, look, we're committing to putting at least 400 so more megawatts of power into the system, but we need support to do this. And we can't do these things by having taxes on people, because we don't want a situation where we're causing economic growth to go backwards. We want to have both growth and reduction in emissions. And so they're looking with us about how do we marry the two. And the approach we've been taking is, in the context of the Quad, is a clean energy supply chain approach, where we try and multilateralize the benefits of low emission technologies. Australia has a number of partnerships that's evolving in this area around hydrogen and other methods. They're all part of our low emissions technology roadmap that the government put out in the last year or so. 20 billion investment in that roadmap to leverage up to 80 billion of investment in low emission technologies. But what we're doing in the context of the Quad is saying, well, okay, how do we multilateralize that approach? Because the important thing is to reduce the cost of those low emission technologies, which makes it easier for particularly middle and lower income countries to take up those options. And that's how you'll get sustainable climate change. If you try and do it through unilateral reduction in exports, or by taking economic growth backwards, you tend to then put at risk public support for going forward. And it's vital at this stage, given the challenge we face with the 1.5 degrees, that we have to take the community with us. So this technology-based approach is something that's being promoted in the context of the Quad. The Prime Minister was successful at the Quad meeting in persuading his colleagues that Australia would host a clean energy supply chain summit early next year to bring people together to discuss about how we take that approach further. That approach is essentially working with our major trading partners in the region, like Japan, like Korea and others, and potentially China, on these common approaches. Now, let me say in relation to China, the strategy of the US in terms of climate diplomacy has been to say to Western countries, to allies and partners, let's all essentially match ambition on climate change as a way of putting more pressure on China to bring forward its net zero commitment from 2060 and when emissions will peak. At the moment, they've got emissions peaking in 2030. The Americans would like to bring that forward into the 2020s, 2025, for example. So look, there's a lot to unpack. I'll leave it there for now, but there's certainly a lot going on. And I know back in Australia, there's a lot of work going on about how we further refine our approach to COP26. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Very comprehensive coverage. I'd like to now invite Dave Sharma and Senator Andrew Bragg to join, and we go straight into a panel, and I'll just throw a question more on climate diplomacy, perhaps to all of you. I'd like to just hear from all of you on how the US and Australia could play a strong role in these geopolitical and national security implications of climate diplomacy. Do you panelists see the potential for this AUKUS agreement for military cooperation to be extended into climate security collaboration? And if so, in what ways can the US and Australia most effectively work together on those initiatives and commitments? Maybe Dave can start.
Sure. Thanks, Christina. I'm live. Look, I think AUKUS is first and foremost a security and a defence agreement, and it builds upon very deep security and intelligence relationships that we've already got with the United States and the United Kingdom. But its purpose, if you like, is really about strengthening and upholding the rules-based global order, just as the Quad is, just as our relations with Japan and Korea are, and the European Union and other countries. And ultimately, one of the pillars of the liberal rules-based order that we in Australia, and we would argue everyone around the world, has benefited from, is international commitments, countries cooperating to solve global challenges, putting aside national differences and avoiding a kind of a race to the bottom, nationalistic type competition, which led the world into wars in the two major wars of the first half of the 20th century. Now, climate change is fundamentally a challenge of the global commons. It's a challenge that every country will be adversely affected by, but that no country can address sufficiently alone. And so, whilst AUKUS, I think, its initial focus will very much be on security and defence and stability in the Indo-Pacific, I think it's part of a growing constellation of nations that are coming together to make sure that we do address some of these challenges facing the global commons, and climate change being very, very high in the order amongst those.
Thanks, Dave. Andrew, would you like to have a word?
Thanks, Kristen. It's great to see Arthur. Of course, I served briefly with Arthur in the Senate, and when he was there, he was my favourite senator. So I'm now in search of a new favourite senator to be revealed soon. But look, one of the things that we do need to work with our friends in the United States on is on more private investment, particularly into the regions where there is so much opportunity for us to not only get emissions down, but also to create new sectors. I've been interested to see some of the new developments in our country around offshore wind are largely being financed by foreign investors. Now, we do have a very large pool of domestic capital, which is locked up through the superannuation scheme. But I think those funds generally have a preference to invest into widely held vehicles. So we will be looking to countries which have traditionally provided a lot of FDI into Australia, like the US, to continue to look for opportunities in the regions. And there's been much debate about the impact on regional communities. It is, I think, telling that at this point in time, that the Minerals Council, the Farmers Federation, which are really two of the major regional groups, if you like, are talking about their preference and their policy to have a net zero plan and a target for Australia. So I think a lot of the architecture is in place, but there is a great need for more capital. And if we are to get these, particularly the electricity emissions, down to near zero, I mean, that will only happen if we put a lot more capital into renewable generation. And there's, frankly, I mean, the federal government has effectively bought out the states of Victoria and New South Wales from the Snowy organisation. But I don't know that the taxpayer has enough money to keep on doing that. So we will need more private investment, and we always welcome that from the US, which of course is our #1 source of foreign investment.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, let's ask Dave what he thinks in terms of what you just said. How can government, or put on the table, what can government put on the table to make sure that investors direct money towards these crucial areas of clean resources development, and what frameworks are needed to ensure that we make the most of the significant export opportunities that may surge with renewables and other technologies at state and federal level? Here in Australia, renewables are developing at a really fast speed. But as Andrew mentioned, we need investors to come, and we have to give the right signals. How do you see Republicans jumping on that, bandwagon of renewables and new technologies, Dave?
I mean, look, I think that there's a critical mass of support cutting across the political spectrum in the United States to support innovation. Everyone loves innovation, but we don't really know what it means. Okay, particularly when it comes to the context of global climate mitigation. And I think one of the fundamental flaws of U.S. climate policy, and maybe I would say Western climate policy, is that it's too focused on territorial emissions within country X, country Y, country Z, right? And I think, look, the net zero targets that we're tabling today, unilaterally for our countries, I think it's good to have goals for out to 2050, but I do think we need to anchor it in a global approach, right? It does us no good if we're not focused on how do we leverage our climate, clean energy, innovation policies together in order to get the global emissions reductions that we need. Because it's clear, if you look at the global carbon budget, particularly 1.5, what is it? We have roughly 7+ years left in that budget. We don't have time to pull together a global climate mitigation agenda to comply with that. Okay, and I think we have to be pragmatic about that. The 2-degree target, that's about 25 years, we do, but we're not going to be able to comply with that if we follow the same strategies. If we're just looking at, getting to net zero in Australia or the United States or Canada, right? Keep in mind that the Paris Agreement has a net zero global emissions goal for the second half of the century, but we're not going to be able to hit the 2-degree mark without figuring out how do we leverage our policies together. And so we have to think big, right? We have to think out of the box. And look, people talk about the need to lower the cost of technologies in order to get developing countries to buy them. And that's very true, because poorer countries are not going to pay that green premium that we're going to pay, because they can't, right? They've got different priorities, whether it's poverty eradication or balance of payments or whatever. But we got to think big, and I think the answer here for us is a merger of climate and trade policy. So what the Europeans are doing, we of course we've got issues with the current CBAM proposal, the CBAM carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal, because how it treats smaller U.S. companies for the most part. But I think Republicans are very interested in this concept, emerging climate and trade policy, and figuring out how do we monetize that competitive advantage, because the United States has a significant carbon advantage over a lot of our competitors, including China. I think we're about 3 times more carbon efficient than the Chinese economy. We're over 4 times more carbon efficient than the Russian economy. And if you look, and I haven't seen the numbers for Australia, so forgive me for that. But if you look at the EU, the United States, Japan, we're all kind of in the same place. And so I think that looking at the formation of a G7 plus carbon club, right? And by the way, and the reason why I talk about carbon clubs is because do you take the United States by itself, the United States only accounts for about 16% of global imports. I think the EU is around 13%. So unilaterally, we don't have enough global market power in order to get the Chinese to become more transparent and to give them an incentive to green their global supply chains in a way that's consistent with the 2-degree mark. Okay, but the G7 plus, you throw in Australia, you throw in Korea, maybe a few others, then you're looking at 45% plus, right? And I think that would by itself create a de facto international price on carbon that would then really help sort of accelerate the greening of global supply chains. But that's a whole different topic. It goes beyond, the amount of time that we have today to sort of lay out, how do you get there? But I think we do need to think big. And I agree that innovation is incredibly important, but if we just talk about innovation by itself, we're not going to get to that 2-degree target that Paris has.
Would you like to comment, Arthur?
Just 3 quick points. You had asked me earlier to talk about what was happening with climate finance here in the US, and listening to Andrew's points earlier reminded me that Wall Street has really gone green. And before the Biden climate summit in April, John Kerry, as the special environmental presidential envoy, had gone around Wall Street and drummed up contributions from the major finance houses of the order of $1 trillion, commitments of $1 trillion each over the next decade, which was really backing up, I think, their judgment about where things are going. And if you look at, for example, Mac Bank in Australia, Macquarie Bank, they're betting big on this green trend continuing and being sustained. So private capital is there. Andrew's right about that. I think if there is major investment in regional Australia from a public perspective in related matters, that will also provide a vehicle to draw in private capital, which would have a multiplicative effect. So that's something to look out for. A second aspect of all this, when we think about international dimensions and clean supply chains, is critical minerals, which are so important for electric vehicles, batteries, magnets, all of these things that go into renewable energy related equipment, and also defence equipment and the like. And Australia has great capacity in all these areas. And here in the US, I was talking to the Commerce Secretary the other day, and after the Quad meeting, she had said to the President, we in Australia have really got to get on this now. We have a critical minerals partnership, but we have great capacity in Australia. We've got a $2 billion loan facility in Australia now for this. And in the US, they're looking at what offtake agreements they can do, which can help realise some of these projects. And for the Australian mining industry in a carbon constrained world, critical minerals offer a new path to apply their innovation and their world leading capabilities. So I think that's going to be important. On trade, there's no doubt there's a trend now for more environmental standards as well as other standards being put into trade agreements, and that will play itself out. Our main concern there is that these not become a cloak for more protectionist pressures. I mean, I think it's very important that we try and be very clear about how these work together. But so carbon border adjustment mechanisms may or may not come. The US is here at the moment, is not in the forefront of the vanguard of this. John Kerry has made it clear that's possibly a last resort. But we want to see first whether we can not only look at ways of penalising countries on carbon intensiveness, but also how do you support and incentivise countries, for example, by reducing tariffs on environmental goods and services. So there are a couple of elements to all of this. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Arthur. We'll try and go back to trade because there's a huge intersection between climate and trade policy. And that's where we can, Australia and the US can have a very strong influence. But I'll get Trent. Trent, you wanted to ask a question to DaveBanks, so you can do that if you wish.
Chris. and I don't want to jump in before my time and take away people asking questions online, but I've already got a million questions from what's been said so far. But Dave, I just really want to ask you about your opening comments about the shift that's happening in the Republicans, and ask really two related questions. Firstly, how enduring do you think that shift is, and particularly could it withstand another Trump candidacy? And secondly, bounces off Ambassador Sinodinos' comments, how much of an influence on the Republicans is the approach of business in the United States? For example, in Australia, we see the business community by and large very active in supporting a reduction of emissions. I'm wondering whether that's having an influence on the Republicans as well.
Good questions. So on how sustainable the shift is for the GOP, let's say you have another Trump candidacy and potential presidency, I think that a couple of things. First of all, you have had a significant shift within the House of Representatives where Kevin McCarthy, who's the leader of the Republican Party there, he's put together a climate package for the first time. And I think that's pretty notable. That's the first time in, at least as far as I know, when you had Republican leadership in the Congress sort of take the lead in coming up with the climate package. And we talked about some of the reasons, but one of the main points when I had my Democratic friends ask me, okay, how can you be so confident that this is for real? And my answer is like, well, politicians chase votes. Right? I mean, that's just the way it is. And if they believe that they can get more votes than they lose on any given position, I'm not saying they always do it, but most of the time they will pick the policy that gets them the most votes, or the political position that gets them the most votes. And so clearly, just given where younger generations are, right? I mean, you just don't have climate skepticism within those younger generations to any sort of major extent. And by the way, when I was working in the Congress and sort of helping sort of develop this shift, I would say that it was really important where the younger staff were, because the younger staff would come to us and say, Dave, we're working, and we really like what you're doing. We really want to get our boss on board, right? And so I think it reflects where the younger generations are in acknowledging the importance of doing something about climate change. And so, if you have this development in the House, and you're seeing some of this percolate in the Senate as well, with Senators Kramer and Sullivan pulling together, and they're very conservative senators pulling together a climate, energy, and workers program. I think that that's all going to take root, so that when you have, even if you were to have a second Trump administration or a Trumpian type candidate come in, I think that the baseline for a lot of Republican climate policy will come from the Senate and the House. Now, a really important point here to make too is that I think that what's happened is that Republicans recognize that the United States is on a decarbonization trend. So we're just in a very different place than we were during the Kyoto debate, and Republicans are just catching on to this. I certainly know from my time working for President Trump that he was not ideological on the issue, but he looked at it through the lens of Kyoto and basically said, if we pursue some type of climate carbon constraint, it's going to undermine U.S. competitiveness, right? It's going to hurt the economy. It's going to cost us jobs. They're going to go to China, which in large part had a lot of validity to that. But I think again, things have changed now, where, again, when we're talking about a potential climate trade policy that Republicans and Democrats can get behind. And one point on that, by the way, just to follow up to what the ambassador said about Mr. Kerry, Special Envoy Kerry, is that you do have a bill that was introduced by Senator Coons and Representative Peters back in July, roughly around the same time that the EU CBAM was formally rolled out, that would establish a U.S. border carbon adjustment. And that that's provided a baseline for conversations around the topic. The second point about the companies, I don't think I don't think the U.S. Chamber and Wall Street have a lot of influence with the Republican Party anymore. I think that President Trump, the Trump administration, helped sort of put a wedge between that on different issues. And I think since then, there was a lot of debate over trade, a lot of disagreement over trade policy, for example. But since then, you've had other issues kind of creep up where I think corporate America has been more sensitive to social policies that Republicans might not like and might not agree with. And so, and I would invite folks to, and by the way, this is a big development, right? And I think a lot of people find it surprising that there are a lot of Republicans that will not meet with the U.S. Chamber now because of all these disagreements. And so I think that when they're looking at shaping a U.S. climate policy, it's going to be focused more, and I hate to say this because of some of the support for multilateralism that was sort of provided earlier, but the United States just isn't there anymore. Whether you're Democrat or Republican, right? We kind of moved into this sort of Sanders Trumpian, like there's kind of a merger of left and right wing thinking when it comes to the United States and the WTO and some of these other institutions that we see as not really working for the country anymore.
Thank you, Dave. I'd like to start asking questions from the audience. Before that, I just want to ask each of you a little question on COP, because it's shaping up as being one of the most important global climate meetings ever held. This year's COP in Glasgow next month. So let me just explore everyone's expectations of COP. What do we hope that will be achieved, and what role do we see the US playing or Australia playing as leaders in bringing other key partners to the table, especially China and India? Let's start with maybe Arthur.
Thanks, Chris. Look, I think what will be interesting, and we still don't know for sure, is the attitude of the Chinese in the run-up to COP26. I don't think they want to be seen to be doing more in response to American pressure, but they do jealously guard, as they see them, their climate change credentials. So I think a lot of the theatrics of COP revolve around what China does or does not do. I think the US has done a lot of heavy lifting in the run-up to COP, both in terms of the change in policy here in the US and also some of its work abroad. The approach Australia has taken to the COP, I mean, there's obviously work going on at the moment, as you can see from all the newspapers which are talking about it the whole time, about what further plan Australia will have, and that will be interesting to see how that plays out. But the important thing from Australia's perspective will be also carrying the argument in the context of the COP around this point about how we work with countries in the region to do exactly what Dave was talking about before, and that is multilateralize the benefits of new technologies in a way that is more accessible and affordable to low and middle income countries. I think that's going to be important. The commitments which are made at COP in relation to climate finance to eliminate the gap that exists there on commitments. There's 100 billion at the moment per annum sort of commitment. I think we're short by 20 billion. Countries are looking at what further commitments they make. So again, look at climate finance as an area that will potentially figure quite prominently there.
Thanks, Arthur. DaveBanks, do you have any big expectations from this COP?
No, but to be fair, and as I tell people, look, I mean, the COP has its role in helping develop, a commonality, as it pertains to climate action. But look, I mean, none of us actually believe that the COP is the silver bullet, or the Paris Agreement is the silver bullet, and that we're going to be able to solve global climate change just working through the COP and the Paris Agreement. So I would really like for folks to manage their expectations. I think that, if we can make some progress, on Article 6, which I think is which is important for a lot of reasons, and looking at offsets and carbon markets, for example. But again, as long as we have a really good rule book, we wrap up all the negotiations, and I think that's all that we should be looking for with that. Because look, I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to have to be plurilateral, regional, bilateral relationships that push us in the right direction toward being able to hit that 2-degree target.
Thank you, Dave. Andrew, do you have any expectations from COP? What do you think? What do you think would be the role of Australia at this COP?
Well, Chris, I mean, I'm obviously looking forward to Australia carrying its fair share at this conference, and I think that's obviously a continuation of our net zero commitment, which came from the Paris Accord. I think we need to show that we're on track. So I think we need to have a revised 2030 target, which gets us to around that sort of halfway mark. But I'm also looking forward to us talking about some of the things that we've been able to achieve in Australia. I mean, we are the world leader in rooftop solar. As a sort of a finance person, I'm very interested in how some of this has been achieved. 15% of all the rooftop solar in the last 12 months has been achieved through buy now, pay later, which is an innovative product that has been largely pioneered in Australia, which is now being exported by Australian companies like Afterpay and Zip. I mean, Afterpay is in the process of being acquired, subject to regulatory approvals by Square in the US. So I'm interested in how we can talk about that, because I think that does potentially lower the cost, or at least improve the accessibility of rooftop solar in other jurisdictions. I'm also looking forward to us sort of shedding this, I think, often unfairly maligned status that we have. I mean, we have done well. We have met our commitments, and so I'm looking forward to us having some clear targets, clear plans, and some plain speaking at this upcoming conference.
Thank you. And Dave Sharma.
Look, just two sort of small observations, I think, Christina. Where Australia can make the biggest difference is in our kind of leadership in certain key verticals, if you like, because look, the scale of Australia is such that, you know, the big countries need to do the heavy lifting on this. We need to be credible with our targets, but ultimately where we can make the biggest contribution internationally will be things like the regulatory environment around rooftop solar. Andrew mentioned that Australia's got one of the best in the world for encouraging uptake and installation and lowering the costs. Hydrogen is obviously another one where Australia should be potentially leading the world in terms of how you commercialise the hydrogen industry and create a liquid fuel and the infrastructure and the shipping and whatnot. And then carbon soil, or the cost-effective measurement of carbon soil and how you can generate carbon credits off sequestration. I think that's another area where we can make a big difference. So those are the areas where I think Australia, you know, we need to be most mindful where we can have a globally significant contribution will be in the modelling of a few kind of key technology advances. The other thing I'd say is, look, obviously China's role here is going to be critical. You know, we can't address this problem without China playing its part. China's about a quarter of global emissions and rising. And we've seen mixed signals from them about whether they're going to hold action on climate change hostage to other interests they've got, and it's something they're prepared to trade, or whether they actually see it as in their interests in addressing this for their own national reasons. And I think that's going to be quite key, because we've seen them use it in discussions with the Biden administration up until now as a sort of a potential point of leverage. If you don't cooperate with us on this file or lessen the pressure on us on this, we're not going to turn up to Glasgow with anything good. And they have played a destructive role in the past, most notably at Copenhagen, but some other key COPs along the way. I'm hopeful, but I'm not confident yet that they now see it as in their national interest to address this, either to take the lead in some of the key technology areas, or because of their own their energy vulnerabilities. They're still hugely dependent upon Middle Eastern energy supplies to run their economy, which, you know, means there's got strategic choke points on the way there, or because of their own susceptibility to, you know, high frequency extreme weather events now.
Thank you very much, Dave. Well, going back to the audience now, and a related question to what we just discussed, maybe that's directed to DaveBanks, because Dave, you said you didn't have high expectations of COP, but Mark's asking here, if bilateral and regional cooperation are key, then unsure why the expectations around COP, which is a global cooperation forum, should be low. Isn't the former a subset of the latter, and isn't there a linkage?
Yes, yes, that's a really good point, and this is what I've tried to explain to my Republican colleagues, many of whom don't support the Paris Agreement. And I say, look, but they support bilateral and plurilateral, partnerships. I'm like, look, of course, there's reasons for us to be skeptical of the Paris Agreement. Look, I mean, one of the big complaints that Republicans talk about now, which is a surprise to me, because I've been working on international climate policy for 15 years or so. They'll argue, look, we don't like the Paris Agreement because it allows other countries to increase their emissions in the near term, and they always bring up China. And I'm like, oh, okay, I get that, but then they will follow up and say, we want to renegotiate the Paris Agreement in order to force other countries to reduce their emissions in line with what the United States is doing. And then I kind of said, well, that's a really interesting point, but do you not recognize you're advocating for a Kyoto 2.0 agreement? And so it's interesting. It's interesting, where people are landing and where they're headed right now. But I do tell them, I'm like, look, in order for us to move forward with stronger bilateral, plurilateral partnerships and relations, whether it's on trade or investment or technology, whatever, the United States needs to be part of the Paris Agreement in order for us to have the type of credibility that we need. Because if we're not part of the Paris Agreement, we're going to be toxic, and countries are going to stay away from us, and we're not going to be able to have any credibility in pitching any kind of diplomatic initiative, even if it's the most brilliant idea ever conceived. So yes, so I totally agree, but there's a very, very strong link there.
Thank you. There's a question from Alice here, going back to investment. In terms of encouraging further private investment in Australia, are there any expectations the US and other international investors would have in terms of reporting frameworks, the TCFD, TNFD? Arta, would you like to answer to that?
I think the short answer is investors always like as much certainty as possible, and where possible, they like to have certainty across borders in terms of the regulatory environment. And certainly within the Australian context, we're looking at disclosure requirements in terms of climate-related matters, the stock exchange. And of course, there's a lot of work being done on that here in the US. And as is natural with these matters, particularly among Western countries, we tend to try and then find ways to make these requirements as transparent and similar as possible to create a neutrality, if you like, which doesn't get in the way of investment flows. I think it's in Australia's huge national interest that we get this right, because there is so much investment, so much capital in these sectors. And Australia, you look across the board of the resources that we have available with us in the critical mineral space, whether it's wind or solar or whatever, great potential. We can be an alternative energy superpower. There's no two ways about it. And I think a lot of the building blocks are there. And Dave Sharma and Andrew mentioned some of those before, particularly the way we've really been world leaders in areas like rooftop solar. So I'm actually excited by the prospects that are there. And I think you'll see over the next few months, as Peter Verver finishes his work with his business attraction task force, the narrative around that will be very much a narrative built in part around clean energy supply chains and the investment opportunities in Australia.
Thank you, Arta. There's a question now on what is the prospect of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, HR 2307, being adopted? Who would like to answer? Dave?
On the US side?
Yeah, I assume so.
that just goes to show me that I know the names of all these bills, or don't know the names of these bills. So I think the odds of us adopting a carbon tax, at least in the near term, are incredibly slim. And it's not because it's one faction that opposes it. I think that you've got opposition on the left and on the right for different reasons. I think that for Republicans, there would be, look, let me back up. Any support for a tax is not a popular thing. Even if you argue that you're going to give it back in the form of dividends, people don't believe that, right? I mean, since when does government, get revenue and give it all back? But I do think that at least in its current form, you have a situation where I think it's very difficult for Republicans and Democrats to support a carbon tax enough to get it over the finish line, at least in the near term.
Thanks, Dave. Well, on carbon tax, on a global level, the OECD, as you're aware, is trying to propose a multilateral approach to carbon price by establishing this global carbon price to reduce, I suppose, threats of global trade wars over environmental policy, in response to the CBAM, I assume. And they mentioned sectoral approaches, which I think I read something that you published, Dave, on sectoral approaches being a fairer game, because sectors are better positioned to implement homogeneous monitoring practices due to similar production processes. At what stance do you think the US, and even for the Australians here online, what do the Australians think that proposal will there ever be adopted, a global price on carbon, for example? What are your thoughts, Ambassador, and then maybe Dave, Sharma, and Andrew for Australia, and then we can get back to Dave.
Thanks. Some people would draw an analogy here with the OECD work on the global minimum tax, which, thanks to a change in the US stance this year, means that a proposal will go through, which is a multilateral proposal to essentially create greater uniformity of tax regimes across countries and reduce the attractiveness of some of the safe havens on tax havens and all the rest of it. I'm not sure you can fully press that analogy into the carbon space. I think it's very complex, because one of the issues in the carbon space has always been giving countries a capacity to differentiate how they tackle these issues. And the idea that you could have a uniform carbon price that low middle income countries might have to face without having a capacity to adjust, not have the resources to adjust, and all the rest of it creates issues. So it's a long-winded way of saying I think the devil is in the detail with a proposal like that. But it'll be interesting to see how the OECD propose to go about developing such a proposal.
Thanks, Arthur. Dave Sharma, what do you think of that proposal?
Look, I think it's certainly worth talking about it. I can see us reaching something kind of a global trade system before we'd reach a global carbon tax and multinational tax avoidance stuff. The risk of displacement activities is relatively low. But when you're talking about carbon intensive industries, the risk of displacement activity, that is the industry just relocates somewhere else, is pretty high. So you'd really need a much more kind of universal scheme than you could just get from doing it within the OECD. And I think that's going to be the challenge here.
Thanks, Dave. Andrew, you have any comments?
Look, I'm always very wary of taxes, and I probably am even a bit skeptical about this OECD idea. But look, I think in the context of the concern in the community about base erosion and profit shifting, I do think that there is a case for doing it, but we don't want to see that lead to the end of tax competition. I don't think that's in anyone's interest. Even if our Senate won't allow us to be competitive, we shouldn't deny other countries that right.
Thanks, Andrew. And Dave, how is that being viewed in the US? Any views on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I can't imagine there being a lot of support for a global position on a carbon tax. Not that that would be a bad thing if we were able to pull it off. I think that there'd be a lot of skepticism as to the whole sort of effort. But I think that's why, I've sort of focused in on, working with Republicans on the plurilateral approach, right? Where you're working, okay, maybe it's an OECD agreement, but not on the tax per se, but on a trade policy that would essentially create a de facto international price on carbon with a critical mass of economic power and market share, right? But that would be sector by sector.
Thank you. We're running out of time. I just want to ask a last question before I hand it over to Trent, which is more an ideological question. Daniel is asking, well, he's stating that both in Australia and the US, discussions and feelings in a very large proportion of the population concerning climate change and energy policy have become matters of cultural identification, almost akin to a religious belief. What would the panelists suggest to encourage a more rational, pragmatic debate concerning climate change? I suppose he's talking about also the conservative side of politics, and energy policy based on science, technology, economics, practical politics, rather than high moral ground preaching. That's a good question. Maybe I'll start with Arthur. Do you have any thoughts on how to change that?
Look, it's a good question, and it would be a whole seminar in itself, because there is no doubt that people who come at this from different ideological perspectives, depending on the sort of values that they put at the forefront, particularly, for example, about national sovereignty versus international collective action, all this sort of thing, can sometimes come to different conclusions on this. The best way to work this through always in politics is you keep talking until you're sick of listening to yourself, and then maybe you'll get through to people as they start to see why you're pursuing a particular matter. We found with things like the goods and services tax years ago, that if you persuaded people that this was being done not because it was in the government's interest, but it was in the national interest, you got a group in the community who said, okay, they're not doing it for their political advantage, they're doing it because it needs to be done. So you just have to keep working it through. That's why you don't always get the first best approaches to climate policy, because the first best approaches won't get political takeoff. You have to go with an approach which actually gets through to people. And if that's a second best or third best approach, so be it. 80% of a reform is better than 100% of nothing.
Very good advice, Arthur. DaveBanks, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree. I think that we really need, first of all, we need to have a rational conversation based on math, as to what we can do today with existing technologies. What do we need to get to, some of these, some of the goals suggested by the science. But politically, it's really hard. It's really hard to sell a policy and its benefits to folks when they're not going to live to see it, right? It's going to be, a generation or two or three on down the line. And we all love our unborn grandchildren, of course, but when you put it to people about how much you're willing to pay for your unborn grandchildren, they don't want to pay that much. And so I think, so finding that is, going back to the ambassador's point, finding that pitch to people to make it beneficial for them at that moment, right? I think it's really, really important. How do we do that? And I think that's one of the things that we've been working on to try to get, yes, conservatives on our side to cross over and work with us.
Thank you, Dave. Andrew?
Well, I don't have much more to add here other than I think that I have always agreed with Arthur's formulation here that people will support something that's in the national interest. And so I think we just need to take the people along the journey here by explaining that if we don't make these changes, then we will all be poorer. I think that is a proven formula.
Thank you. And Dave, any thoughts?
I think in most areas of public policy, I'm very sceptical of zealotry, and zealotry everywhere in this debate. zealotry, extremism, and the kind of people who allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And I don't think that's a recipe for good public policy in any area, this one especially.
Thank you, Dave. Well, we're running out of time, as I mentioned, so it's my pleasure now to invite Trent Zimmerman, the member for North Sydney, to make some final remarks.
Thank you, Chris. And can I start by congratulating DCC on putting on together such a wonderful forum, like all of the series that you've been doing this year, and you've been bringing the world to Australia over Zoom and giving us an opportunity that we otherwise wouldn't have had. And I should say that I think what a lot of your regular listeners wouldn't appreciate is the work that C4C actually does in bringing together parliamentarians and legislators from around the world together to talk about the type of issues that we have today. So for me, as an Australian parliamentarian, having had the opportunity to talk to like-minded Republicans or Conservatives or members of Parliament in Canada has been really valuable. So thank you for that, Chris. And it's great to see Arthur. Arthur, you're still my favourite senator. There hasn't been a good one since from New South Wales. But thank you for joining us from Washington, along with DaveBanks as well. Look, it's been a wide-ranging discussion, and there have been several themes that have emerged. But I think, firstly, from the US angle, Dave, it's been very heartening to hear about the shift in the Republicans, and I do hope it is enduring, because obviously it's been a game changer having the US playing a more proactive role under President Biden for global efforts to reduce emissions. And it is an interesting time, because I think that when the Quad started to come together, people were a little bit unsure about what that would mean, but it is really important that the Quad is focusing on issues that are relevant to climate change. And when you think about it, amongst the Quad's 4 members are 3 of the world's largest top 5 emitters. So it's a very valuable forum for Australia to be part of that. And it is an important time for Australia and for the globe as we head towards Glasgow. I'm a little less cynical than DaveBanks might be about the importance of Glasgow. I think that these things are never the end of the journey, but they're important stops along the way. And it will be a fascinating couple of weeks in Scotland. But can I just thank you again, Chris, for organising today and for all that you're doing to contribute to good policy development in Australia. And thank you to my colleagues, Dave and Andrew, who I'm working with closely at the moment, funnily enough, on this issue, and to Arthur and Dave as well for your participation. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Trent. And thanks again to our guests joining from the US for their time and insights, especially DaveBanks and the Honourable Arthur Sinodinos. We'll hopefully do a follow-up webinar. I think that lots of things we touched. There's so much more to talk about, especially the trade part of this conversation. But Dave, we wish you success in your future climate endeavors in the US with the Republicans, and hopefully COP will bring all of us together to the table. And as Trent mentioned, it's a very important part of the puzzle for us to do well at COP. Now, thanks to our audience as well, and everyone that has been supporting C4C. If you are not part of our group, please sign up on our website, coalitionofconservation.com.au. Our next event will be next week on the 20th, and we're going to talk about Brazil and Australia on hydrogen, green hydrogen, as 2 powerhouses of the Southern Hemisphere in renewables. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks again, Arthur. Have a lovely night. And Dave, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
See you all. Bye.
Great to be with you all. Good on you.
Thank you. Bye.